Robert Bogucki undertook a 6-week voluntary survival journey in northwestern Australia back in '99.
Police haven't given up hope of finding missing American Robert Bogucki alive.
An enormous search was launched for him. It was a national and international news story. And in this episode, I speak to Erin Parke, an ABC reporter who has lived in Broome for 20 years and really has spent years trying to track down Robert Bogucki and find his side of the story and answer some of those really deep questions. So we delve into her journey, his journey, some of her journalistic background, and also some of the Aboriginal overlays in the Kimberley. Hey Erin, thanks heaps for coming on. You're up in Broome, yeah?
I am in sunny Broome at the moment. Right now I'm stuck in my office with my work in progress pin-up board going on there for the podcast I've been working on, but it is a beautiful sunny day outside there in Broome.
And that's your ABC office that you're sitting in?
Yeah. I've been up here for almost 20 years with ABC in the Kimberley. I think a lot of people come to the regions and they just do like a year or two and then clear off back to the city. But yeah, I'm a bit of a stayer up here because I love it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm keen to dig into. So obviously Robert Bogucki's story is like a really important case study worldwide, really, for survival. And so I'm keen to really get into that. But really, to start with, I'm just keen to understand your short life story of where you grew up and how you got into journalism, what journalism's like, and then your interest in survival, which is, I'm sure, is there, and then how that led you into Robert Bogucki's investigation.
Well, I had a pretty suburban upbringing in Perth, actually. I was born in the Pilbara, which, if people don't know, is like pretty remote area up here in northern Western Australia because my parents were school teachers. But I grew up in Perth, and luckily my parents instilled a love of camping and the outdoors. Even though we're in the city, they really made an effort. Every school holidays we would go down south, do some stuff like that. So the seed was planted. But then it wasn't until I was about 20 years old that I ended up coming up to Broome just to do a few units of Indigenous studies when I was at university, and I just fell in love with this place. I think it's how casual and relaxed the Kimberley is. People are so down to earth, and they're not judgmental. They're not pretentious. And if you come in and you're like genuine and you mean well, people will sort of take you at face value, and they're not like interested in shopping and Botox and materialism, you know?
That's definitely, yeah.
And that keeps, I kind of sometimes think of it as being, pardon my language, a bit of a bullshit radar. But in a good way. It sort of keeps you real. And as a news reporter, it really sort of helps keep you accountable. So I actually started off at uni up here, and I worked as a barmaid at the oldest pub in town, the Roebuck Bay Hotel, which is, I think, like working behind it. Have you ever worked behind a bar, Mike?
No.
Well, you've not really lived till you've worked behind in a country pub.
I am missing out on a chunk of life experience. I should do it once, just for 6 months.
You could have a gap year where you work in hospitality. But no, working behind a bar, like, it was just a great way to kind of get a feel for the town and the locals and some of the local folklore. That's where I first heard about Robert Bogucki and his miraculous survival story. I ended up circling back a couple of years later once I started as a news reporter. I said to ABC as soon as I started with them, this is back in 2008, I said, if ever there's a job going in the Kimberley, in Broome or Kununurra, let me know because I would love to come back up. Sure enough, job popped up, and I've been here pretty much ever since. I've done a few stints working in Sydney and Perth, mainly just to, I think like a lot of people in different industries and occupations, when you're in a remote area, you have to really hustle to get better at your job and get opportunities that you can then bring back to, what you do. So I've made an effort to do that. And 20 years later, here I am.
Yeah. And you really do extend your personal interests into your work as well, which we'll get onto with Robert's story and going to Alaska and stuff. Yeah. But actually working in a pub, and I had another journalist, being a taxi driver is another good way to get a feeling for what the everyday person thinks. So
absolutely.
That is definitely one of your things. Because I should say too, like, you did a story on my Kimberley expedition back in 2017. So we met then once in Kununurra, and so I've kind of followed what you've done since then. So when your name pops up on the ABC, I'm like, okay, that's what Erin's doing now. And you actually do quite a lot of. You do 7:30. You sort of pop up on them all over the place. Is there anything in the ABC you don't really do?
I'm not great at TikTok content. I won't lie. Can't teach an old dog new tricks. But no, I'm really trying to, I really love like documentary, long form podcasts. So really trying to move into that space. But when I first met you, Mike, I remember that really stuck in my memory because it was a bit of an intersection for me of like my love, maybe a little bit like you, is actually more like history stories and not necessarily news of the day. And so that story, I mean, that was an incredible snapshot of survival. I mean, that was an epic story, and the fact that you were bringing that back to life. So that was a nice way for us to meet, I think, because of that shared interest in it. You brought together outback survival, resilience, the amazing landscapes, Indigenous cultural history, and to be able to bring that to life for television. Like, what a joy of a job this is at times like that.
Yeah. And obviously, um, the race relations, I don't know if that's the right word.
Mm,
It's not really the right word, but that's a real factor up in and
yeah.
everywhere in Australia, but particularly Northern Australia. And that's a delicate balance that you got to take as a journalist because you can't take a side. You've just got to do facts and, like,
Mm.
how does that work?
It's a really good question. I'm actually glad you raised it because I think sometimes people don't like to talk. There's almost a bit of a taboo thing about,
Yes.
talk about race relations. I mean, there is an intersection that is still sort of a two worlds are still colliding in very live time in northern and central Australia. And I think it's good to talk about that because it's not always easy and it's not always an easy thing to navigate. Like, I try to be very aware that I am a white person that is reporting on and living amongst a culture that is not mine to talk about in some
Yeah.
ways. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you've encountered the same thing where
Yep.
you just have to almost like just keep checking yourself and sometime and just trying to be aware of like, am I the right person to be telling this story? Just because I find it interesting doesn't mean I have the right to barge in and be asking people about it. And it does become very personal. Like, I don't think I wouldn't have stayed in this part of the world unless I cared deeply about um, the hope that things can get better and that, reconciliation, that we can all find a way to be living together and really respecting each other. I know that sounds really cheesy, but it's not always easy. And the media has a long history of not doing a very good job of
Yeah.
representing the voices of Indigenous Australians. And so it's a constant thing of, sometimes people don't want to talk to me. They don't trust the ABC, and that's okay. Like, I've got to try to develop a bit of a thicker skin to sort of understand that and just do what I can to showcase stories where people really want to tell their story, often for the first time.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, that's right. If you're telling someone else's story, and I think we probably shy away sometimes too much from talking about Aboriginal issues because we're like, oh, I can't talk about that. Whereas so like for example, for me, like I love throwing a spear and a woomera, and I'm effectively copying the experts, really. And I've only ever had one comment saying, "Hey, stick to your own culture" or something like that. And that's out of a lot. And so
Mm,
but so that's why I think it's important if you are using Aboriginal knowledge just to keep reminding people that, hey, this is somebody else's knowledge. You
yeah,
can definitely overdo it, but I also
yeah,
think we do need to keep talking about the issues because if we don't, then it doesn't get any better. And another thing too, which this is another tricky one. Like a lot of people judge Aboriginal Australians on what they see in the streets of Catherine and stuff late at night, and they just completely miss the fact of all of the things that have happened that deliberately destroys a culture, prevents you from speaking your language, and so
mm,
that's the interactions they have with Aboriginal people who often have been basically kicked out of the communities because of those
mm,
social issues. And the Aboriginal people that you and I deal with are elders who have, I would say, extreme levels of knowledge and understanding about so many things. So when I think of Aboriginal knowledge, that's what I'm thinking of. But when you have people who come up from down south and they can just judge completely on what they see on the street late at night,
yeah.
which doesn't represent Aboriginal culture.
No, and like I definitely don't want to sort of try and make out like I'm some authority on these issues. But I guess that's where the value for me of telling stories about the history of how we've got to this place and this point is so important. And that's not picking a side or that's not casting judgment, but it's really just being honest. That truth telling process of because many people don't know. The history of the Kimberley and the history of colonisation in this country, and the more we do, the better we're all going to get on, I reckon.
Yeah, yeah, and that is the history is pretty bad in Kimberley, but it's not good anywhere.
Yeah.
It's And so you're interested in survival. So I know you're going camping today, right? And
I'm
so
so excited to be going camping. Don't tell
where
my
are you
boss,
going?
but I'm going to clear off a couple of hours early today and I'm going to get out bush. I'm so excited. So we're just going up the coast. We're really lucky in Broome. There's a scattering of Indigenous run tourism operations. They're sort of still really like earthy, like they're not super shiny, super developed, but they're coastal blocks and you can roll up and we're going to be camping up on a cliff top at Pender Bay. I think the whales are going to be jumping in the ocean at this time of year and we'll just have a campfire and relax. And I have been spending so much time on my phone lately. It's like this compulsive, it's getting worse and worse. And so I'm just going to try and leave the phone in the car and hopefully stop doing that nervous twitch of checking it constantly. So yeah, I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, cool. And you're interested in survival as, aside from camping, because they're two separate things. Camping is different from
Mm.
survival. Where does that interest come from?
Look, I'm not as super, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge. I love what interests me is the drama of the storytelling because I've
Yeah.
worked for tabloid newspapers back in the day. Like, I think just because we're ABC doesn't like it doesn't mean we can't be drawn to dramatic, sensational stories of human experience because who doesn't want to hear about things to do with life and death? There's something about survival and the human condition. Gosh, don't want to sound pretentious here, but the question of what you learn when you're close to death is just, I think, universally fascinating. And I'm always just, there's something about the landscape of Australia, its vastness, this continent, and the way humans interact with it, the way that over the centuries, well, millennia, but more recently, people have moved on and off this continent, the way we create roads to try and make pathways to try and control and make sense of a landscape, and then the way that we inflict mobile phone coverage. It's all of this encroaching thing of trying to control this landscape. And it's such a delusional thing to try to do because the country is like, I've never done survive. I've not done hardcore treks or anything close to what you do regularly, Mike, but I've done enough to have a taste of how vulnerable we are as humans, and that's really humbling, and I kind of like that feeling because it sort of puts in context all the minutiae, all the trivial things that you're stressed about. You go out there and you're like, it's like everything just clears away and you do sort of think, I am alive, but I could not be alive for much longer if something goes wrong out here in this moment. And I think in contemporary society, we're so buffered, at least in Australia, we're privileged enough to be largely buffered from life and death considerations like water, like clean drinking water and shelter and things like that. So it's a real reality check, I think.
And in many ways, the Robert Bogucki, the guy we're really going to be talking about, and your podcast series Expanse, where you really investigate his life and motivations in a way, that's what he was seeking. He was trying to get away from all that noise.
Yeah,
And yeah,
Robert
so let's jump into
Bogucki.
it. Let's
Shall I do a
tell me
quick
the story.
recap for those that aren't
You should.
familiar? Oh, where to begin? Robert Bogucki. So this is a strange saga that played out in 1999. Robert grew up in California. He was from a well-to-do, highly educated family, but he was quite disillusioned. He was struggling in life. He doesn't use the word depression, but he was brought up with Catholic faith, but he was really feeling despair at the state of society in a lot of ways. What he decides to do is he wants to go into the desert basically and fast. And he's seeking spiritual strength. He wants solitude. There's a long history of humans fasting as a way to deprive their body food as a way to get like mental clarity. So in 1999, he's on a cycling trip around Australia with his long-term partner, Janet. And he decides this is the time I'm going to do this. He's 33 years old. He's a strapping, fit, good-looking young chap. He's worked as a volunteer firefighter and a paramedic. He's resourceful and he wants to do this alone. And Janet flies back to America. He rings her up and says, "Can I have your blessing?" And she says, "Yes, I know you need to do this," which is an incredible thing because what he was wanting to do is go into the desert for 6 weeks, taking a very small amount of food and water initially, walk across the Great Sandy Desert, which is a distance of around 600 kilometers, basically departing from Sandfire Roadhouse, which is a few hours south of Broome, cutting through this vast, really dry landscape and coming out near Fitzroy Crossing on the Great Northern Highway. What he doesn't anticipate is that his bicycle, which he dumps after just the first night, because he's going to cycle originally, but the sand's too boggy, so he dumps his bike, and it's found. It's found 2 weeks after he sets off, and it triggers this enormous search that costs $10,000 a day. Police are out there, they mobilise planes, helicopters, troopies, and in the end, that search has to be called off. Robert's got no idea he's been searched for, and this whole thing goes on. After 6 weeks, he ends up being found alive. An American search crew has been brought over by his well-to-do family in California.
Need to be what we call semper gumby, always flexible. At this point, obviously, we pick up sign. If we pick up any new sign, there's no question we will extend the mission.
And I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms. But the American search crew ends up doing another search for him, and there's media helicopters accompanying them. And on day 43 of his journey, a Channel 9 helicopter spots Robert. And you would have seen the footage, probably, Mike.
Yes, I did.
What did
Yeah.
he look like? What was your impression when you saw like the state of
He,
him at that time?
I thought he looked skinny, but honestly, not too bad. Like you can see like there's certain bones that stick out on his shoulders a little bit more, but he still looked quite capable to me.
Have you ever got to that level of malnutrition?
I'd have to know what his BMI was. You wouldn't know what
He
his what?
lost 27 kilograms. He was a fairly, probably more heavy set than you. I mean, not big, but he was like sturdily built. He had a lot of probably muscle bulk. He'd been cycling around Australia,
Yeah,
but he wouldn't have had a huge amount of fat to lose. I'm not sure the exact weight. It was 27 kilograms he lost. But this is what's incredible. It still blows my mind. He's out there 6 weeks. He does find water several times in the first few weeks. He comes across a couple of billabongs and he refills his water bottles. At one point, he digs for water in the sand because he's quite like resourceful and he had
yeah,
good instincts. And he found water. At one point, it was such small amounts of water, he was using a little tuna can just to try and get the little bits of moisture that he could. But in the second half of his trip, he goes for a period of 2 weeks without drinking, which is so much longer than what the textbooks advise a human body should be able to endure. He basically doesn't eat. At one point, he tries eating some little sickly sweet flowers, but the sugar rush actually makes him keel over. And actually, that's the moment he describes feeling the closest to when he thought he was going to die because his body hadn't had anything. So he basically goes 6 weeks without eating.
yeah.
And he's
And
walking the whole time. Like he's not sitting down relaxing under a tree. He is walking. So the fact that he was in as good a shape, everyone was shocked at the hospital. There's all this footage of him in the hospital bed. They've got him on a drip and they're a bit worried about him, but they're all like, no, he's not. He was not on death's door, you know. And
yeah,
Robert reckons he would have been able to walk out alive. And that's a really interesting question. Would he have been able to? And puts this down more to not to do with any physical aspects so much as he had such strong, renewed faith in God and faith in his own resilience because of what he'd been through on that journey that he's like, you know what? I would have done it. And when he says that, I kind of believe him.
yeah. And I don't think it's fair to put him in the case of a religious crackpot, which a lot of people might think. Like seems to be a very well considered kind of guy.
It's a really good point. I think especially in Australia, when people hear someone talking about God, sometimes people might roll their eyes a little but Robert is not, he's not an evangelist and he's a highly intelligent person. He's very well read. He's very self-reflective. He doesn't suffer fools, but only in the sense that I think the time that I've got to know him, because I actually traveled to Alaska to meet him, I think what he did in 1999 had a profound impact on him. And it's sort of, my sense is that he doesn't have much patience for banal chit chat, small talk. He's very interested in the big questions in life. And I find that, that's wonderful to be around someone like that.
Yeah, and he really had the courage to go and find out. And that's what is so, he should be admired, I think, for having the courage to go and try and answer a big question for real. And obviously, we definitely talk about, the responsibility and all that kind of stuff for doing that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think I have a lot of respect for his desire to actually find out an answer.
The phrase, it's become a bit of a mantra for me, like the concept of not, you don't want to die wondering, right? And Robert
Yes.
had this strong, he was not happy. And unlike a lot of us, he was like, he decided to do something about it. He knew what he needed. And I think a lot of us might have times where we feel a bit dissatisfied with our lives, or we know that we're not quite as happy as we could be, but so few of us would actually take that step of not just being proactive about, like, I need a circuit breaker, but also he was willing to put his life on the line for this. He was open. He didn't want to die, but he knew that he might die. And I think that's an important distinction. He didn't have a death wish at all. He wasn't sure that God wanted him to be alive, and he did not want to live without finding that out. And what's really fascinating, Mike, is after he was rescued, the fallout. And we've got a whole podcast episode that looks at, like, the backlash, because people did not know what to make of him. If he'd been trying to, like, break a Guinness Book of Records, people would understand that. If he had got lost because he was a bit clueless, people would have understood that. But the idea of doing this deliberately on a spiritual quest, people didn't know what to make of it, and they judged him really harshly. He was nicknamed Kooky Bogucki, which is such a mean thing. And you think, like, if that happened now, like, I don't know what you reckon, but I feel like people would be even more judgmental if something like this happened now, because especially with social media, you have this pile-on of being like, he's this idiot, what's he doing? And I don't think Robert deserved that. I think he was, like, misunderstood.
Yeah, definitely. I heard something which I kind of agree with, about that stress. If you have constant stress, it's because you're mulling over a decision about something. Whereas if you mull over it and you decide a well thought out reason for doing something and you execute on it, the stress goes away, because a lot of the stress is trying to decide something or figure something out, or not having the courage to take action. And he basically obviously had this big stress in his life about the meaning of life, and he hasn't met God.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm going to get rid of that stress. And he even said in that interview, when he said, I think I scratched the itch that needed to be scratched.
Bogucki was on some sort of quest which he had trouble identifying this afternoon from his hospital bed in Broome.
I can't really say specifically what it was, but I do feel satisfied that I scratched that itch, whatever that was, that sent me out there in the first place.
He went out there and he found an answer, and he seems like content from that experience.
Yeah. He's still, because he was really generous with his time, and I was able to sit down in Alaska, here in Broome, out in the desert, and do these lengthy interviews with him. And I found it a little, I felt a little bit anxious about it, because you know that sense when you're talking to someone that you feel like is a bit wiser than you, like, I didn't want to waste his time with stupid questions. But at the same time, like, I wanted to ask the questions that everyone was wondering, like, why did you do it? What did you learn? How did it feel? How's it changed you as a person? And he's very humble. When I say, like, did it solve the problem that you had? He's like, it was an incredible experience and it changed my life, but I'm a work in progress. The challenges in life don't just go away because you do a spiritual quest in the desert. But the thing that impacted me most about what Robert described was, I get emotional just thinking about this, the way he described dealing with adversity and challenge and pain. And he's like, what I did made headlines. He didn't mean it to, but everyone was like, it was this big dramatic thing of, like, an ordeal in the desert. But he's like, people go through just as difficult things in everyday life. He brought up repeatedly the example of people raising young children. He's like, to me, that is like how challenging that must be to your soul and your spirit at times, with exhaustion and fatigue. And he talks about, caring for aging parents and living in poverty. Like, he's like, the way he put it was, we've all got our the crosses that we carry are all different, but we all have our cross to bear. And I was like, wow, like, people, these outback survival feats, or these things in the wilderness that people do that become really famous, like Christopher McCandless going into Alaska, people focus on those dramatic little chapters, but there's a lot of very quiet, private stories of resilience that are being overcome by people in everyday life.
Yeah, and that is one of the best coping mechanisms to be able to deal with your own hardship is think about people who've done it harder. So, I mean, John Muir, the guy that walked alone across Australia and 128 days, look, probably the biggest feat of Australian survival that I can really think of. His One of his motivating factors was thinking about maybe his grandfather or something like this. It's been a while since I've read the
Yeah.
book, but he uses that as a coping mechanism. I use it on mine. I think about the ship, like, well, in the Kimberley, for example, those aviators, they went through way harder stuff than what I went through.
Yeah.
So yeah, being able to rationalize your own hardship, it helps you deal with it.
Yeah. And I actually have found myself, I think of Robert a lot now when, like, throughout this podcast production, I've been having some stuff going on in my private life that's been challenging. And it's been a really interesting process of, it's not that like I look up to Robert as like an inspiration, but some of the things he's said have really resonated with me. That discomfort is okay. Like, you
Yeah,
don't have to be happy all the time. You don't have to be comfortable all the time. And you don't have to keep everyone happy all the time as well. So I do find him, I still, even though I've listened to these interviews a lot of times, I still every time find something fresh that resonates with me.
so this podcast series that you made, how did that start and how did you end up paying your own airfares to Alaska for an ABC story?
I look back and I'm like, wow, that was really a bit bonkers. Like, it was back in 2022, and it was such a long shot. Like, it was the COVID pandemic was finally impacting up here, and so the news cycle was really repetitive. It was like impact of COVID on housing prices, and it was all important reporting. But I was just like, started going down this rabbit hole of some of the strange things that have happened back in the Kimberley in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There's so many crazy stories, and I reached out to this thing with Robert Bogucki. I'd heard about it for years. I'd heard snippets of the story because it's part of like kind of the mythology around here. Like, there's a cycling group in town called the Boguckis, and their motto is getting lost to find yourself. So he pops.
Let's go.
He's like a running joke, like a reference. It's almost like a coded thing amongst locals. They'll make like a Robert Bogucki joke. Like the women say, "Oh, I've got to go on the Bogucki diet," when they're like put on a bit of weight or something. And so I started looking into it and looking in the ABC archive. And the more I found out, I was just like, and it was a long shot, but I just thought, I'm just going to reach out. I'm just going to try and contact, like, where is he now? And I was able to find a couple of people that were in contact with Robert Bogucki still. Ben Martin, there's actually, and Troy Hynum and Paul Bell. They're incredible local guys that were reporters at the time, and they ended up building such a strong rapport with Robert Bogucki that they kept in contact, which is remarkable. And that's a sign of, like, they obviously were good at their jobs because there was a high level of trust there as reporters at the time. And they reached out to Robert and Janet and said Erin would like to get in contact. Anyway, skip forward. It took 3 years, like, with no guarantee of what was going to happen, of sort of persistence of emailing, trying to build the relationship, starting to reach out to people, because there's like Aboriginal police liaison officers that were involved. There was SES volunteers. There were all these locals that are still in Broome, started to reach out and started to just record all their stories. And from the very outset, I was very interested in capturing in the perspective of Indigenous people who were involved, because their voices were never really heard at the time. In the end, cut to mid-2024, and Robert and Janet said, come to Alaska. Let's sit down properly. I had met them briefly in Australia before that. And I went to stay with them. And I went for, I think I had about 2 weeks in Alaska, 5 days staying with them. And they live in this log cabin on a forested mountain range about in the forest not far out of Fairbanks. So this is interior Alaska. The first thing they gave me was like a little canister of bear spray. So that kind of set the tone. They put me in this little beautiful guest cabin. Robert built the place by hand. He like cut the logs and dragged them up this hilltop. And it's a beautiful place, and it's so tranquil, and it's so quiet. And what really surprised me was that remote Alaska was actually a lot surprisingly like remote Northern Australia in a lot of ways. It was full of like renegade maverick people that were trying to get away from rules and regulations, and a few weirdos, and just the challenges of living such an isolated lifestyle. So that was a real surprise.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that a lot of people, when they live in normal society, I don't know, let's just say Sydney or LA, they kind of feel like I'm part of someone else's train set and I'm just acting a
Mm.
part that I've been told to play. But when you go to Alaska or when you go to Broome, okay, I'm life's on my own terms. I'm steering the ship here. And I totally agree with that sentiment with Alaskans and well,
Mm.
anyone that lives in remote and beautiful areas. It
Mm.
doesn't have to be beautiful, but anyone that lives in remote
Yeah.
places.
And I think there's like a duality. It can be a beautiful, positive thing to do with being who you want to be and not maybe having to conform. I actually, in the podcast, I include this random chat with the taxi driver that drove me from the airport in Anchorage to where I was staying briefly. And he's like, the thing about Alaska is a lot of people here, they come here to get away from things. And if you want to like start your life afresh and be who you want to be, this is the place to do it. And that can be a really positive thing. It can also, there's can be a bit of a darker underbelly to that of people that have something to hide.
Hmm.
Have you heard of the three M's before, Mike? The phrase the
Uh,
three M's?
no.
It's to do with the kind of characters that are drawn to remote Northern Australia. There are three types of people: the missionaries, the
Oh
mercenaries,
yeah,
and the misfits. So
misfits. Yeah, I heard
people
that. Yeah.
trying to save souls, people trying to make a quick buck, and people that can't fit in elsewhere. I'm not sure which of those three I am. I like to think I'm none of the
Misfits.
above. Um, but I think there is a bit of truth to that. There can be a dark side to that. And as a news reporter up here, I've seen a lot of that. There's been famous cases I think over in Queensland as well. People actually on the run from the law that
Yeah.
I've discovered living in a remote rainforest. I think there's less of that now, for better or worse. I think Outback Australia is probably in some ways becoming a bit watered down and a bit more like everywhere else. And that's
Hmm.
because of, I think that's the inevitable, spread of regulation. There's just has to be compliance with more rules and regulations.
Yeah.
And I think,
Regulation and population, I think, too.
yeah. And just that with social media and so on, you're never feel as far away and remote as you used to. Like this weekend camping, I'll probably be in phone reception, whereas 5 years ago I wouldn't have been. And again, like everything, there's good sides and bad sides to that. For residents, for the local, if there's an emergency, yay, there's phone reception. But it does make me sometimes feel a little nostalgic. And I'm not a rusted on local, but I do sometimes already. I'm
Getting a bit
sounding pretty
rusty.
middle-aged here, but feel nostalgic for some of the characters that we had in this part of the world that don't really exist the same way anymore. But there's also a hazard of romanticizing the past. So maybe I just need to go remote and become a local eccentric and keep the
And
tradition alive.
and when you went there, paid and so you paid your own airfares. They obviously wasn't sponsoring you going over there.
Yeah, and to be clear, it wasn't commissioned by ABC. I was just doing this in my own time. And that's because I didn't know what was going to happen. I couldn't guarantee. You never want to overpromise and underdeliver. I'd rather
Yeah.
have autonomy with the storytelling until I know that I've got something worth telling. So yeah, when over there, I took leave from work and I think it took 5 aeroplane flights, connecting flights to get to Fairbanks.
And that is actually one of the reasons why commercial TV won't really fund anything unless it's a safe bet. So commercial media won't fund things unless it's a safe bet because so most adventures, it's a very good chance that it won't work out. And the people who
Mm.
invested their time and money won't get anything. So they only bet on safe bets. But real adventures and real stories, you know, they're not safe bets. And that's it's a
Yeah.
different story. But when you were going over there, you had no guarantee that he was going to talk, and you literally got to the last few hours, and he hadn't really agreed to be taped, right?
Yeah. There was an understanding that that him and Janet, Robert Bogucki and his partner Janet, were going to sit down and do interviews. But they just, so I arrived there, and because being a broadcast, I just wanted to record everything because I already had the plan for a podcast, and they were just like, no, they just didn't feel comfortable. I think they just wanted, it was important for them. And this is an important thing for Robert. It's like, put down your devices. Just don't be worrying about doing 300 things at once. Just actually, they wanted me to spend time, I think, and actually take a deep breath and actually get to know them and actually get an understanding of where I was. And I'm actually really grateful for that, because I think a lot of us, it's sort of like, it's like this ingrained slight anxiety. Like for me, it was like, I need to be recording all sound effects of everything that's happening. And they were like, no, just don't do that. We just, like, we'd go berry picking. We went like picking blueberries, me and Robert, down in the valley. And he took me shooting, which is something that I've never done here in Australia, just target shooting. And, we'd go into the veggie patch, and it was a real lesson in, this is a very Robert Bogucki thing, but about relinquishing control, because I tend to be a bit of a control freak. And with something like this, like, I'd come a long way and I was really anxious to record everything, but it was like, interesting lesson in, like, no, just calm down, Erin. And then right at the end, the very last day, we ended up sitting down and doing really lengthy, detailed interviews, which was a huge relief. But can I just tell you something really quickly that happened that didn't make it into the podcast, but couldn't make this stuff up. I was doing the final interview, and my fairly B-grade recording equipment, because I had to use gear that I bought myself, not the top-notch ABC stuff, it started flashing on the digital screen saying card error, card error.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
I just about died. I was during the interview, and I was with Janet. I said, Janet, and everything was on this one SD card in this device. I felt like crying, but again, of course, you'd be proud of me, I always have a backup plan. I had another basic microphone that I could put into my phone. So I was like, Janet, let's do a backup. So I was like, focus, Erin, do that. Robert was driving me to the airport, and I said, Robert, I think I've lost this whole thing. I think I've flown all the way to Alaska, and he just sat down and did a 3.5-hour interview with me. And I think this card is rooted. And he's so funny. He just sort of chuckled, and he's like, I'm sure it'll all be fine. I got to Seattle, where I was staying with some Australian friends, and I was like, I was a mess. And I found this digital retrieval, because in Seattle, like, there's a lot of high-tech IT stuff, and it was like one of those specialist stores where they would do like digital rescue. And I started crying, and I was like, the card, it's not working, because we tried to put it into my friend's computer, not reading anything. And this poor guy, he was like 19, and he was just looking at me horrified, like this Australian, bedraggled, like tears running down my face. And I was like, please, 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 I'll pay whatever. I should never say I'll pay whatever. I paid a lot of money, but they were amazing. I got the phone call. I was down the street drinking my third coffee. All 27 audio files were retrieved. And that day I checked my emails, and I'd got an email from Robert Bogucki, and he said, Erin, I've been painting the bathroom, and I've been thinking about your SD card, and I hope you're not feeling too anxious. Remember, sometimes the story is not about the messenger, it's about the message. And I was like, I didn't even know what it meant. I was really sweet of him. He was thinking of me. But it was such a little moment. But, it was a very Robert Bogucki moment, because it was about control. It was about going, you know what? I may have put everything that I have into this project, and I may have lost it all, and that'll be okay. It won't be the end of the world. But in the end, all 27 audio files were retrieved, and we have a podcast. So it's a happy ending.
Right. That's good. And some of the survival, I don't want to say survival feats, because it sounds like it was deliberate, but so the survival rule of threes, which I have a great deal of issues with, which states that a human can go 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food.
And there's something about shelter, I've heard, with a 3 in it somewhere as well.
People are extending stuff either side of it, but really only one of the two of them hold true. The oxygen one's okay. The water one, 3 days without water, he said he went 2 weeks. And that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, was how believable is he? And then after listening to your podcast and listening to his audio, you're like, this is a guy that doesn't have a big ego. He's tried to hide from the limelight. He's got he's not trying to impress anyone. He's trying to do the opposite of impressing people. He's an understated person. And he's an experienced outdoorsman. Those are the most trustworthy people. And so I just couldn't think of any reason to disbelieve his statement that he went 2 weeks without water.
No. And I don't think anyone has ever seriously doubted Robert Bogucki. I mean, at the time, there was discussion of like, oh, has he done this as a media stunt? But it very quickly became apparent that, exactly like you say, he is so staunch on no one ever making a dollar off of his story. He has never made a dollar off of his story. He didn't want anyone to know he was missing. He can't stand the media. I mean, it took 3 years. Like, I've ended up doing this storytelling with him, but you know, it's kind of like blood from a stone, bless his heart. So I do not doubt for a moment anything in Robert's account, because I've got to know him fairly well, and he is the most no bullshit person, and he's got no motivation to exaggerate. If you're exactly right, if anything, he understates and downplays what he does because he doesn't want attention. And he's not very interested in the technical aspects of how he survived. Because I did ask him this. I was like, how did you survive when so many other people wouldn't have? Because I tell you what, I have no doubt if I was in that situation, I think I would have been dead within a week. He views things from much more of a spiritual perspective, and I guess almost psychological. So when he talks about survival, yes, there's things about, oh, he had this much water on this day and then he didn't have water for this other day. But the journey for him is measured more in his psychological, spiritual state. He had periods of despair, which he describes, and this is all in the podcast, in his own words. It's like he talks about the hardest thing was not so much the parched throat or the physical, or his like bleeding feet. The hardest thing was a sense of despair. And he describes these moments where he was so hot and exhausted and dehydrated. He would sit briefly on a rock, and he knew that if he didn't get up at that moment, then he would probably never get up and he would probably die there. And he's not being melodramatic with that. The journey that he was on was not so much about finding the next bit of water. It was wrestling with the feeling of despair. And he found, there was one point right in the middle of his journey, he came to a beautiful natural sand bowl, and it just called out to him, and he decided to sit there for 7 days. And he just sat there, contemplated, watched, didn't talk, didn't eat, didn't drink. And he describes a feeling of elation and this surge of faith in God and faith in his ability to keep living. And that's what got him through. And I don't know if you've heard, I think it's really rare to hear a first-hand account of that kind of experience. But does that resonate for you? Does that make sense?
It does. I don't have the spiritual overlay that a lot of people do. And my rationalist mind, and I don't want to be disrespectful in any way to the way he views things, but I don't have that spiritual mindset. I would rationally say in my explanation that religious overtone is a coping mechanism, the same way that thinking about other people going through hardship makes my hardship not seem so bad. But that's only because, I just don't want to have any disrespect to his view on it.
Yeah.
So for me, for example, and his survival situation sounds harder than anything I've done as well. So maybe I haven't got to where he got to, because I haven't gone for more than 3 days without water, and he went 2 weeks. So but his desire, he said, like, you just want to sit there, and if you didn't move, you would die. That is a constant thing. And most people have a very low threshold where they just, even after a day, some people can just be like, that's it, I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. And they kind of give up. You do have to divorce that side of your brain that says no to discomfort and just get up. So he had that drive. But yeah, I'm not qualified to comment on his spiritual journey effectively.
And I think he is a very unusual character in that his single-mindedness, his sense of discipline is extraordinary. Like, And like everything in life, there's pluses, there's positives. You know, in some ways, I, with all respect to Robert, I'd say he's probably quite a stubborn person. You know, but the strength of that came to the forefront in that situation. I mean, not most people would never even do something like that in the first place. Never mind be able to have the strength of conviction to continue on once you're out there. Because after that 7 days in the sand bowl, I said to him, from the way he described it, it's sort of like at that point he'd found what he was looking for. He felt the presence of God, and he felt like God was with him in the times of despair, and that God was what had wanted him, loved him, and wanted him to survive. So I was like, why didn't you could have turned back at that point? But he had made that plan, and he wanted to stick to it, and he had absolute confidence that he could. And I think it's that confidence that he could. It's the self-belief. That's not necessarily a self-belief as in like, I am so amazing and I can survive, because he wasn't thinking it in terms of like a survival. He never wanted to prove that he could survive. That was not the point. But it was more confidence that God wanted him to be alive, and therefore he would be alive. What's interesting is the perspective of people surrounding him that were with him in the 24 hours went after he was pulled out of the desert. So, you know, interviewing police and doctors and volunteers that interacted, saw him, and they were like, he would not have lasted much longer. He was very close to death. So their belief is more like Robert would have died within 72 hours.
I got to be honest, I've got very little respect for that opinion, for their opinion. So you've got this guy that's just lived it, breathed it for 40 days, has lived the experience. If he says that he reckons he could have walked out, unless he got bitten by a snake or some unforeseen thing happened, he's the guy I would believe. And that's the thing, like at the start when you're talking about, you know, the textbooks, we often reference the textbooks about what textbook survival says you can go 3 days without water. That's the really interesting thing. Also what he was challenging. Well, I like to challenge those things. Who wrote the textbook? Someone 1700 years ago.
Textbook been into the desert for 43 days and 43 nights.
But honestly, who writes things down? It was, and then so the next person that writes something, well, the only reference is that. So once something is written and it gets copied 3 times, it becomes fact.
I think
there's a lot of that.
I agree with you, but I also think, just for the sake of responsible messaging, most people would not be able to survive what Robert survived. And I don't, I think there is value in being very respectful of the warnings and the advice around, like, just basically not being reckless, because Robert was a very experienced outdoorsman, and I just think it's worth noting that not everyone would be able to survive that long.
I agree, but their comment that he wouldn't have made it would be hold true for an average person, but in a way he's not.
He's proven himself to not be an average person.
Exactly.
And so I guess that thing is, it's almost not being rigid and limiting, isn't it, in terms of the capacity of people to survive and to be resilient. What I find really interesting, though, is the context when we're talking about this is a privileged white guy who chose to do this. There's so many people in the world right now that are struggling to survive in an actual way. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Like, all of this discussion about how much capacity of humans to be resilient. In Australia, we're talking about that in a way that's generally relating to people that are well-to-do enough to go out prospecting, to go out hiking, and to do things like that. But there's a whole edge to this as well that's like far more high stakes, and that's not something about enlightenment. That's something about legit, like actually trying to stay alive right now, and that's a whole other scenario.
I agree. But then I also don't think that because there are other people who are just struggling to survive, that it should mean that every person who has the ability to go and do a deliberate adventure shouldn't, out of respect to those people. That doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. And I think my impression is that most people
head in to the bush or outback Australia, or they're there for the best possible reasons, and they should be there. Not many of them are on spiritual quests like Robert Bogucki. People do get into trouble, but I think, overall the benefits outweigh the negatives of getting out bush and pushing your experience levels in terms of like being in remote Australia, because I think it can only be good for people.
Oh, definitely. And I think that is where organizationally, organizations, the media, the government, we want to keep protecting people. And basically, the solution really is no one undergoing any risk. We've done our jobs. I can't be held responsible. And
Just
so
stay in the suburbs.
yeah, don't do anything. And the problem is, well, we're humans and we want to live a life. A lot of us do. And so when governments start telling you, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, I think those are basic human rights that you should, if you have control of your life and if you are doing something which doesn't negatively affect other people, and then we can talk about Robert's case where it did affect other people, but I think you should be able to take your own risk. And if the government says, well, no, it's my job to control the risk that you take, then you're going to need officials standing at skateboard parks telling 12-year-old kids, no, you can't do a double backflip. You can do a single backflip. And so the person deciding that would be a bureaucrat that probably has never ridden a skateboard. Like the person that understands the risk most is the 12-year-old kid that's already done a single backflip and he's contemplating doing a double backflip. So like it's a slippery slope. If you start being the nanny that says you can't take risk, where does it stop? And it doesn't stop. And so it reaches into certain areas more than others.
And I guess that's the philosophical and ideological tension that's it's a theme throughout the podcast as well, because what Robert did was a very like lightning rod polarizing example of that tension between the freedom of the individual to take risks versus the responsibility of the state to protect people from themselves. And the way that plays out in a practical sense is like every day in the Kimberley, if you go to a gorge, there's a winding rocky track. Should they install barriers there? Because it is hugely traumatic and horrible when people die. Like that, we have like Karajini National Park where I remember from memory, there was sort of like at least every dry season, someone would slip and die. And that's traumatic for the first responders and it's traumatic for the communities and obviously the families of those involved. So I can see both sides of that. And then, of course, there's the public calls for like, oh, they need to do more to put barriers in. So in a way, sometimes the authorities are responding to public pressure. I guess at what point, if people want to put themselves at risk and potentially die, and they are of sound mind, how should the state respond to that?
I think they should let them. And I think if they want to absolve themselves of responsibility, like legal responsibility, I think something like an indemnity form where you can say, hey, look, I in sound mind, choose to go on a very long walk in the bush and I'm not going to tell you where I'm going. But if you don't hear from me, please don't look for me. Like, I think you should have a basic right to do that.
Because that's something that humans have historically been able to do, isn't it? It's a fairly recent thing that only because now everyone knows what everyone's doing in a way that 80 years ago you wouldn't have known if someone was going to the bush alone, would you?
Yeah. But in that case where I was talking about basically absolving the government of responsibility, and you took a look at Robert Bogucki's case, let's just say arbitrarily 15% risk of death for someone doing what Robert did. But there's someone doing a quadruple backflip on a mountain bike, for example. That's legal. There is no one standing with a clipboard at the end of the mountain biking jump, even at a national competition that is run in Australia, saying no quadruple backflips. I think the quadruple backflip might be 16% chance of death.
More dangerous.
Yes. Yeah. So if you're going to assign an actual risk of death, then you can't arbitrarily do it right one thing into the other. So I think you shouldn't and you can't. And the people who would be making those decisions on what the risks are don't have a freaking clue what the risk actually is. So don't do it.
So there does seem to be double standards or different standards applied, I think, like you're saying, to different endeavours. If you're doing an extreme sport, that is considered socially acceptable. If you're kayaking across an ocean to break a record, that is socially acceptable. It's like ideal, you put on a pedestal. But if you're trekking in the desert alone to find God, that is not socially acceptable.
Yeah.
And that is deemed to be recklessly risky. But you've got people jumping off cliffs, doing
Yeah.
stunts for YouTube stuff, don't
Yeah.
you? So you're
And,
right.
and
It's not.
I think the cliff jumpers should be allowed to do it, and then I think everybody that makes a personal decision to take risk. But I do think you really have to make every effort not to impact other people.
So
So
carry your EPIRBs,
yeah,
have all your backup plans.
mind you though, so Robert felt that wouldn't have scratched his itch, and he didn't want to. And I think he should have the right not to take one. I don't think it should be mandated that you must carry a device. And I think for him, he was just unlucky that someone found his bike 25 k's down a dirt track in the middle of the desert. Because if they hadn't, he just would have popped out a week later and no one would have heard of him. Or he
Or
would have
he would have
admitted it.
died.
Or, yeah, and he just would have joined the missing persons list that's got thousands of people on it. Either
Yeah.
way, that was his wish, and he wouldn't have impacted anybody.
And you know what? The people closest to all of this, right? The people most impacted bore him no ill will because of that. His partner, Janet, loved him enough, and this is a fascinating little side thing to this, is the nature of that romantic relationship. I don't know if I could give my blessing to my loved ones to potentially do it, to die in a thing like that, but she did, and that's a really stoic kind of love, and so hearing her perspective was absolutely fascinating. But she wasn't mad at Robert. The policeman that did 24-hour 7-day-a-week shifts searching for him, they weren't angry at Robert. It was the people furthest away and least affected that were writing the crankiest letters to the editor. There's one I've got pinned. Can I just read this to you really quickly?
Sure.
This is a letter to the editor from 1999, not long after he was rescued. It's Pamela from Yokine, and it's this thing about Robert Bogucki. She concludes, he was obviously a selfish, ignorant, rich kid looking for attention, and he needed a good smack in the mouth. Never mind the anguish and expense caused, nor the American rescue team. Some people should never be rescued. So why does Pamela... I can see the concern about the use of taxpayers' money. And I think perhaps the more moderate interpretation is that Robert wasn't selfish in doing what he did because he never meant to be searched for, right? He was maybe a little, not naive, but sort of underestimated how things could play out. The fact that there was this potential thing that, because he told his parents what he was doing and he told his partner what he was doing, so maybe he should have anticipated a bit more the possibility of this playing out. But there was no malice in that, So the fact that it triggered such a strong, visceral reaction from people is really interesting.
Yeah. Yep.
They were really angry at Robert.
Yeah. But I think they're the people that can't see the reasoning or the reward or the benefit of what he was doing. And you can't please everybody, that's for sure. But I also want to say too that, I'm not saying that everyone should take risk all the time. It's tragic when people that don't understand rips in Australia go to a beach and and drown.
Yeah.
So, but really, that is a reflection that as a society we don't have the ability to manage risk. We deliberately avoid our kids being exposed to risk, so they never learn how to deal with it. They go to a beach and they drown. So that is part of the problem. So it's all kind of all or nothing. You either expose people to risk and let them learn how to do it, or you never let them do anything. And that's where there's a grey area and we're tending more towards don't let anybody do anything, and then they're going to be subjected to more risk.
I think you can manage risk, and I think there are still ways to minimise risk but still undertake incredible outback, challenging wilderness quests.
Yep.
I think what I find really interesting, and you're right in the mix of all this, is how so many people are fascinated by the idea of outback survival and the practical skills, and people really seem really interested in that at this moment. There's such a flurry of the TV shows like You're on Alone and ones like that, and I just find it really interesting. Like, are these people actually applying the skills at all, or are they actually just like not leaving their suburban home and just scrolling in their bedrooms and getting vicarious thrills? You know, what do you reckon?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say probably half the people are just they don't have no intention to go and be in discomfort. And like I was saying, like at film screenings, people come along and people literally say that I've got no interest at all in being cold, wet, and hungry and starving, and but I'm
But
quite
we
happy to
like to
watch.
watch you doing it.
That's right. Yeah, but there are plenty of other people that have varying degrees of wanting to do it, and then there are a lot of really competent. I don't want to use the word extreme adventure because as soon as use the word extreme, people think it has a negative accommodation.
Yeah,
Um, but there are a lot of very competent people who watch that stuff because they want to learn a few extra
yeah,
tips, or they just it's better than watching maths. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Of course, they're going to want to watch the things that they like to do.
Yeah, and I notice a lot because Broome, like a lot of seasonal tourist towns, every year we have this influx of caravanners and travellers, and they fall into it's quite there's different categories. There's sort of like the retirees in the like the big rigs, the caravans, and so on, who tend and I know I'm generalising here, and I know there's a lot of exceptions, but are generally on a fairly established route, and they congregate in large groups at the caravan parks and they'll do the gib. I hate that phrase, do the gib. Like it's
Yeah,
something you do and then you just get to the end and then it's like, I do the gib. It's like, slow down, enjoy the gib. But there's a lot of really young people, young couples. They've got these amazing setups, not necessarily the fanciest cars, but they just really know what they're doing. And they're not wanting to congregate at the caravan parks. They're
yeah,
really wanting to find wanting to get off the beaten track in a really genuine way. I get a little bit, I mean, this is just my personal irritation, my two bob, but this thing of putting a drone up at every scenic location you get to. It's like you come all this way to find solitude and have your campfire and get away from it all. And then it's like, you're like, and then you're like back on the laptop editing something for Instagram. I kind of feel like it doesn't that detract from the experience. There's like an irony there that they're not quite getting. But I mean, that's not everybody. But I think
yeah,
it does seem like there's a lot of really young people that are really adventurous and really wanting to get out there, which is fantastic.
yeah. And I think those people that are putting the drone up and putting all that effort into editing, like I do,
Mm,
really, in a way, they're trying to do it. So if I can make a living from doing this, I can keep doing it. You know what I mean? So they're taking a hit in their
yeah.
now solitude to be able to do more solitude, but even though it's always affected by content creation. I mean, it's the, yeah, it's part of being a content creator for sure.
But are they kind of missing the point and missing the experience potentially? Look, I'm not that I don't
Yes,
want to sound
it's
judgmental. It's certainly not. It's just a handful of times I have thought this beautiful gorge was so quiet until you started filming it. And but I do see little God, I'm sounding like a really grumpy middle-aged person, but there are little signs saying drone-free zone, which I think is a good development. But the
yeah,
positive side of this is they're also getting amazing awareness about these beautiful, stunning outback places in Australia. So, that's got to be a positive thing as well, to at least be planting the seed of like this is what's out there if you get outside the cities.
and I think with drones, because I've fly drones a lot and I'm an advocate of drones, but really you need to
Mm.
have empathy for other people. And if another
Like
person's going to
everything.
be,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like loud music. Like you shouldn't go and play loud music at a lookout,
Yeah.
and you shouldn't have a drone flying. Or if you want to fly a drone, go somewhere where no one can hear, or have it so it's 300 feet up and no one can hear the buzzing. But just yeah,
Yeah.
because it's not good. And so with Meridu, so he was the Aboriginal tracker that came out and looked. That's really
Mm.
interesting too, because so Robert is on a spiritual journey, and there's a strong spiritual overlay. And can you just talk a bit about Meridu, the Aboriginal
Mm.
tracker, and what his spiritual overlay was, and his past issues in the desert?
Yeah. So it's a big part of the podcast, Mike, is weaving together Robert Bogucki's story with the story of Maradu Walbody, who was a Yalparidja elder. So he grew up out in the eastern edges of what white people call the Great Sandy Desert. He was born in 1952, and he didn't see white people until he was 12, 13 years old. So in 1964, I think the timing he tells the story was like, he always remembers the date because he was told the Beatles were playing in Sydney, in Melbourne or Sydney, but it was the week the Beatles played in Australia, was the week that he came out of the desert. Someone just told him that at the time, and it really stuck with him, which I always find really, like, talk about two different worlds playing out. I mean, can you imagine growing up in the desert? Like, he was living a traditional lifestyle, and he describes seeing little signs of white people. He was out hunting with his father one day, and they saw strange tracks that they'd never seen before. And they followed the tracks he said they walked hours and hours and hours through the night. And he said it was like a snake, but it wasn't a snake. And they were car tire tracks.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
He describes hearing a cow mooing for the first time. He does this great impression of hearing the cow, and it's just crazy that we have, like, within people alive right now walking around in the streets that have, like, been at that intersection of two worlds. And that, to me, in a lot of ways, is kind of more fascinating than Robert Bogucki. But to bring those stories together, because Maradu was called out to help search for Robert Bogucki. There were three senior Aboriginal men that were living in the Bidjidanga community, which is on the edge of the Great Sandy Desert. And the police were smart enough to know what they didn't know, and they called in these guys and said, can you please help? We found this bike, there's footprints going into the desert. I mean, that was pretty alarming for them. Can you help us try and track this guy and we got to find him because he's not going to last long out there. And Maradu, you can hear this in the podcast, the way he describes it, he's like, I was thinking, who is this crazy man gone into the desert? There's just this, like, what's that word? Incredularity that, like, why would a man from the other side of the world go into this place that Maradu knew firsthand was so hard to survive? And he's a beautiful storyteller. And earlier this year, not to give away too much of the story, but Robert returned to the Great Sandy Desert for the first time, and we were able to create this situation where we sat down and he met Maradu and the trackers, and having them compare stories and experiences in the desert was a really special thing, and it's a really powerful moment, I think, in the podcast.
And he, once again, maybe we're spoiling things too much, but hopefully people that listen to this are going to go listen to the whole series because it's an important one to listen to. There's a lot of really good info in there. So Maradu felt that Robert had done the wrong thing, and can you explain, because this is actually relevant to other times that you're on country as well. Can you just explain what he felt that Robert had done wrong?
I'm always a little bit hesitant just because, this isn't my thing to be putting into words. But in general terms, people can hear Maradu explaining this himself. But so when I first contacted him about Robert, I've known Maradu for years, but when I first brought up with him a couple of years ago, do you remember this thing with Robert Bogucki? He was like, yeah, I went out there. I was like, oh my God, I didn't know he was actually involved. So I started talking to him about it, and he'd laugh about Robert, and then sometimes there'd be flashes of, like, anger. He'd describe him as, like, stupid man. And I didn't quite understand where that was coming from. And I ended up, after a bit further conversations, and this is difficult stuff to talk about. It's not my stuff to talk about, but there's a very, I think, close connection for Indigenous people in a way that we'll never understand, fully comprehend, between country, life, and death. They're so closely entwined. You don't mess around with that. Robert went out there and potentially was going to die. And when Maradu and the truckers were out there, they thought they were going to be finding a dead body. And for them, that was not a good feeling. The connection with that country is such that there's a feeling of responsibility if bad things happen. And Robert was not respectful. Well, he didn't know what he didn't know,
Yeah.
Like a lot of Australians, he didn't comprehend that there's a reason that people like Maradu will have a smoking ceremony if you're going out on country, to this is described, the scene is in the final episode of the podcast, the smoking ceremony, to let the spirits know, we are coming onto country, we mean well, and you will be safe and you will be cared for. And Robert didn't do that. And the way the trackers describe it is they could sense bad spirit following Robert. And Robert describes that feeling of despair and darkness. And to bring these men together and listen to them, it's a very spiritual thing that's not easy to talk about. But to hear them in their own words comparing what was going on, it aligned incredibly. So I get goosebumps just thinking about it.
You know when your SD card had its spaz and you were thinking what Robert said to you about, okay, it's probably just good. The message is more important. You need to sit down and talk these things. In some ways, that sounded similar in a way to Aboriginal people, is you can't explain these things. And I just saw a comparison there, but that Robert's now sort of connected it in tune with things. In some ways, it's not the same, but in some ways, it's Aboriginal people are the same. They want you to come, sit down, put your phone away, and talk to them and understand them, learn their story. And that's a similarity, I guess, I just saw between what Robert said and what Aboriginal people seem to be like.
I think with both the men and both of those conversations, the thing that stuck with me was it's also about control. Again, this thing of like, we are not as in control as we think we are. I think our society at the moment, we really create this illusion to ourselves that we are in control. We drive where we want, we eat what we want, we set our alarms when we want, and there are moments that just in a split second, I think, can remind you that you're not a natural disaster. I think both Robert and Meridu really deeply understand that they are not in control, and you need to be humble about that and be respectful of the landscape, because you can't control it and you can't guarantee your safety necessarily.
And for what he said, which I think is really important to note, life was tough. In his own words, that life living in the desert. Meridu, yeah, it's really tough. Water's really tough. It's a hard life, and but we've got to be careful about assuming that all Aboriginal life was the same, or all Indigenous life was the same. Living in a desert is a much more tenuous survival situation, because it can be a drought for 3 years, and how do you survive? Whereas if you live in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, you're never going to have to worry about water. There's breadfruit growing off the trees. Like in Papua New Guinea once, there's all this breadfruit growing everywhere, and there was a town right there. And I said to this lady, why hasn't everyone gone and picked the breadfruit? She goes, oh, there's breadfruit everywhere. There's food everywhere. But the desert is a very hard place to survive. And so it's a harder place to survive. You have to treat it with more respect than you do a jungle place with lots of food. And
I think it's easy to underestimate the extent of the knowledge that is still held by people like Meridu. He was there till he was 13 years old, right? I cannot, how nuanced and detailed that knowledge must have been to live off that landscape. I mean, think about the attention Robert got. Oh my God, he survived for 43 days. These guys are living for tens of thousands of years in that landscape. And it would not have been easy, but I do find it really sad. Again, just on a personal level, it's just that knowledge in society right now is not valued. It's about whether you have a job and, this and that, and if you've got a nice shiny car and stuff like that. It's like, there's people walking around the townships in Australia that are carrying with them the level of knowledge that if something went seriously wrong in terms of natural disaster, or not to sound like apocalyptic, but that is the knowledge that I could just imagine a scenario where could potentially come a point where that will become crucial again. But sadly, there is a generational shift that's occurring, because people of Meridu's generation, there aren't that many left, and that's incredibly sad. Just that generation of people that grew up in the desert are utterly irreplaceable. And I think one of the main things I was, always conscious it's not my place to be telling people what to care about, but just to sort of capture a little bit of that, to say this man's life is incredible, and the knowledge he has and the story that he has and what he's endured, and to be so gracious and generous with no bitterness or resentment, to be so committed to reconciliation and sharing his knowledge is utterly inspiring.
Yeah, exactly. And you're saying that there's this shift to everyone wanting to watch more shows like Alone and all that kind of stuff. Those people need to try and get to know Aboriginal elders, because you'll learn so much. They have so many of those answers and those experiences that many of us are looking for.
Yeah. And also, some ideas around sorts of values, spirituals, not spiritual so much, but, I think there is a lot that we can learn, or at least just listen, or at least ask the questions sort of thing. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
been an incredible, just on a personal level, incredible experience getting to know the people I've got to know through this podcast. And I think, if people do listen, you'll hear, especially the final episode, it is, um, I'm not an objective onlooker in some ways
Yeah, yeah.
to this.
But I
This
think that's
adds,
good. I mean, I think that's real journalism, because you actually there's some really big questions to answer, and I think you did as good as like you. I feel like a lot of those questions got answered, or at least it defined the left and right of arc. So you go, okay, I can see both sides of that. I hadn't thought of that.
yeah, I think the longer I've been a reporter, the more I can always see two sides to every story. So sometimes it does, yeah, I'm very reluctant to sort of say like this is the way things are, because it's life's complicated, people are complicated. But I guess the beauty of a format like a 6-part podcast, and there is a bonus episode that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks to do with Garrison Gunslinger St. Clair, who was the American search leader. That's a whole other can of worms, but you'll really enjoy that, Mike. But I think that having a long form like this, show you can tell a story in a much more fulsome way. And I think Robert Bogucki's story needs that, and I think Meridu's story needs that as well.
Yep. And just quickly on Garrison, so
Mm.
the cigar smoking American accent guy.
Footprints that go in two directions. They are barefoot. They are obviously since the last rain or since the last significant wind.
I actually had a fairly good impression of him too, just from watching and listening and seeing some of that footage. He seemed, yeah, he's got the caricature cigar and all that kind of stuff, and he's got the American accent and all that kind of stuff. But like the capabilities of American people should never be underestimated. And he did have a vast range of experience. He was there as a volunteer, not accepting any money. So I think as Australians, we tend to look at people and we love to have a bit of a laugh. But whilst
Yeah,
he didn't understand our landscape very well, he seemed to be
he got
fairly
things
humble
done.
and respectful as well. Even when they found him, they're like, "Oh no, good on the
Mm.
Chapa guys. They did a good job." And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. For those that aren't familiar, he was the one that was in charge of the US search team that turned up, which are called the First Special Response Team. And they were the top of their game in terms of, I think body retrieval was actually their main focus. So they were all volunteers from all around the states, and they were top of their game. Trackers, paramedics, all these specialty skills. And Garrison was based in Miami. And when he turned up in Australia, people, like you said, people didn't know what to make of him. They're like, is it? So one of the things in the podcast, the way it's described is he goes, again, pardon my language, is he taking the piss? Like he was just so over the top. He was so
yeah,
cartoonish. He'd talk in military parlance. So he asked people to call him gunslinger. That was his. I think it's kind of like a radio. You're ex-military. Is there like a radio nickname or something? That's how
oh, no, yeah.
something to do with helicopters.
Being ex-military, we would never use that term. Mind you, American military is different. We don't use call sign like in Top Gun as Maverick. We don't have that. You don't call yourself by
Ah,
a name, because then you're identifying yourself, which is a security breach. So
well,
there is differences.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't want to give too much away, but the reason we've done this bonus episode is it turns out Garrison Gunslinger St. Clair was not who he said he was. And
Ah,
maybe he was a bit larger than life because he'd never been in the military at all.
ooh,
So we've ended up doing some digging, got in touch with the Miami Herald, the investigative reporters there that did some work on him in the early 2000s. As a result of the Robert Bogucki saga, Garrison became a bit of a well-known figure, but his story had some serious holes in it, and he actually died in quite unusual circumstances in Mexico. So we've been able to pull together that full story, which has never really been told, I don't think. And that's
Yeah.
been done as a bonus episode that people can tune into. That'll be out in late August.
Awesome. Cool. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Is there anything else you reckon you should cover off on or say before we wrap things up?
No, not really. I think that's all been. No, I'm super happy.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that the ABC has supported your interest in this. It's good that they have seen the benefit in following someone's passion and knowing that there's a story at the end of it. So I'd say well done to the ABC.
Yeah, I think I'm incredibly grateful. Our production team has been amazing and good on the ABC. This is a bit of an unconventional story that, like I pitched. It's like, here's this story about this crazy American that went into the desert, and here's the Aboriginal elders that, you know, and I don't think anyone else in Australia except the ABC would, be like, yes, let's do this. Let's tell that story in that way. That is a bit unconventional. And I'm really, really proud of the story. And I hope people will listen to it because it's not about bloody me. It's the stories. Some of these stories are stories that voices that are very rarely heard, and they have very dramatic stories to tell. So I can't wait to hear what people think of it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks heaps for the chat, Erin. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate your support, Mike. I think we have really similar tastes in stories, in storytelling, and interests as well. So one day we should do an extreme outdoor adventure together.
We should take some water though.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with Erin. I'll put a link to the Expanse podcast series that she's just created, and it really does go into a great bunch of detail. You'll hear a lot of Robert's own words, and that's the best way. Just hear his words from him. It's really important. And, overall, you probably figured out that I sympathise with the guy, and had he just walked out in the bush and no one found his bike, I reckon he would have popped out the other side. And it reminds me of another one that just happened a few months ago in Australia. A guy was searched for by the cops. They found him after 3 days. He was just camping by himself at a campsite. And really, it sounds to me like it was a miscommunication between the person that he told that he was going camping, and there was just a misunderstanding. And so he ended up, some cops turning up and him walking out of the bush and all this news crew there, and he's just like, they said, "Oh, well, what would you like to say?" And he basically said, "I don't really want to say anything, but I'd rather be back out there in the bush." So it is a reminder that you really have to be so careful about leaving details now, because there's just no appetite for any doubt. And I totally sympathise with the rescue authorities. If there was just a tiny element of doubt that someone needed to be looked for and they didn't, then they'd be held responsible. So yeah, you've got to really commit to, what am I doing? Who's my point of contact? Leave the details. Take a satellite messenger and also a PLB or EPIRB if the situation calls for it. That's the best way to avoid those things happening. Avoid the embarrassment. And also that bad feeling that you have when you put other people out. But anyway, I thought this was a really interesting case study, and I'm really glad that Erin got the answers that she got. Thanks very much for listening.